Cyberwork listeners, I have important news before we dive into today's episode. I want to make sure you all know that we have a lot more than weekly interviews about cybersecurity careers to offer you. You can actually learn cybersecurity for free on our Infosec skills platform. If you go to infosecinstitute.com/free and create an account, you can start learning right now. We have 10 free cybersecurity foundation courses from podcast guest Keytron Evans, 6 cybersecurity leadership courses from also podcast guest Cicero Chimbanda, 11 courses on digital forensics, 11 courses on incident response, 7 courses on security architecture, plus courses on DevSecOps, Python for cybersecurity, JavaScript security, ICS and SCADA security fundamentals, and more. Just go to infosecinstitute.com/free and start learning today. Got it? Then let's begin today's episode. Today on Cyberwork, our guest is Maxime Lamothe-Brassard, founder of LimaCharlie. Maxime has worked for Crowdstrike, Google X, and Chronicle Security before starting his own company, LimaCharlie. Today's episode goes deep into thinking about your long-term career strategy, so don't miss this one. If you're thinking about where you want to go in cybersecurity in 2, 5, or even 10 years from now. That's all today on Cyberwork. Welcome to this week's episode of the Cyberwork with Infosec podcast. Each week, we talk with a different industry thought leader about cybersecurity trends, the way those trends affect the work of Infosec professionals, and offer tips for breaking in or moving up the ladder in cybersecurity. After graduating from the University of Victoria with a degree in computer science, Maxime Lamothe-Brassard began his career in cybersecurity working for the Canadian government as part of the Communications Security Establishment, or CSE. CSE is Canada's largest cryptologic agency, providing the government of Canada with information technology, security, and foreign signals intelligence. As part of the Canadian intelligence apparatus, Maxime worked in positions ranging from the development of cyber defense technologies, counter-computer network exploitation, and counterintelligence. After leaving the government, Maxime provided direct help to private and public organizations in matters of cyber defense. He was an early employee at Crowdstrike, then worked for Google, where he eventually landed in Google X. Maxime left Google X, where he was a founding member of Chronicle Security, and in 2018, he founded LimaCharlie. Maxime has a very interesting career arc. He spent periods of time with 2 major names in tech and security before founding his own company. So we're going to talk about that. And we also want to talk about standardizing methods for security tool integration and whatever else comes up. So Maxime, welcome to Cyberwork.
Hi, super happy to be here.
So you have a pretty storied career here, and we always like to go back to the beginning. So what was your first spark getting excited about computers and tech, and specifically cybersecurity? What was the draw?
I don't think it was one specific event, honestly. I was in the very earliest kind of people raised with a computer.
Yeah, you were just in it since you can remember.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So the computer part always been there for a long time, and then when I started university, it kind of switched over from just users of a computer into like programming, and so that was interesting, seeing a bit more. But security really started for me when I joined CSE. So it's a very special organization. And when I joined initially, I had nothing to do with security. Like I built Java.
Okay.
But I could see internally sort of, people doing security and kind of like a little bit of it internally. And so I was really, really interested. And I applied as a internship. So it was an internship program that I was there under. And so I applied for my next internship to go back into the security part of it.
Okay.
And so really I think the thing for me was starting that and getting that first realization that we use computers all the time, and it can be easy for us to not really know that whatever we're using underneath is understandable, right? So
yeah.
like as a user, I never, like understanding programming seemed like very opaque and difficult and whatever, right?
Sure.
And then you start programming, and then you as you're programming, you're like, oh, the operating system, like, yeah, can't touch that. Like that's kind of a big thing. And then every time you get into it, you kind of learn more, and you realize that after a couple layers that like all those layers were built by humans. It's.
It's demystifies it piece by piece, but you can't do it all at once. Like you can't just kind of look into the guts of the machine and say, I understand it. So it's like you're sort of stripping back the layers that way.
Exactly. So when you're able to like take off the hood and you start messing on the inside, and that's kind of where the security aspect comes in, right? The whole concept of like hacking, and you realize that the computer will just do whatever it's set to do. And if I start, putting stuff in there, then, good things.
I think that's an interesting twist, especially in terms of just the evolution of technology, because, we put toast in a toaster, but no one ever like expects you to know how to sort of like take it apart or repair it if something goes wrong. Like all of our other tools, they either work or they don't, but the computer, I think, is kind of one of the first things where there's a real sort of investment in understanding like the guts of the machine and not just using it, like you use or even like an iPhone, like you have to know like what the underlying motives are and what the underlying sort of systems, and you have to sort of figure your own security out and things like that. So I think that's interesting that you put it from that way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, it's not for everybody, right? But
right.
I think, I suspect we're going to talk career at some point, but like when you talk career, like knowing, the depth there is really, what's going to help.
Yeah. So how did you come to work for the Department of National Defense in Canada? I mean, and also, can you tell me about some of your work roles there? You said you started out as an intern. Was that right? Internship?
That's right. I started an internship building corporate, like, totally normal, you could do anywhere Java software.
Okay. And then, so you said when you sort of saw the interior security aspects of it, you said, oh, that's interesting. So you kind of re-upped and sort of changed your focus a little bit. Is that right?
Exactly. It was like internally, it was sort of, the group that most people wanted to try to get into, because obviously, if you translate that into like US terms, right? If you intern at the NSA and you're, you kind of want to do the cool stuff, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Now, was this I'm assuming this was kind of a learn on the job situation. Were you doing sort of like your own study on the side, or were they giving you all the tools you needed to kind of do the work for them?
It was very much the first case. I think, and I think that is singularly the reason that, my career kind of took that specific direction, was that, they didn't say, hey, this is the thing you need to do over and over again, or like everything, but rather the exact opposite approach. Where I joined, they told me, I think on the first day, and I kind of like that idea. They said, whatever you build here during your internship, we will never use it. Like, don't worry about that.
Okay.
Don't worry about that. We want to see, what you can do, how you learn, and we'll get ideas from what you're doing. Like,
interesting. Yeah.
But don't worry about the thing itself. And it was a green field. They, essentially told me like your project is, and obviously there's things I can get into, but like, something like super generic, right? Your project is, I don't know, like Windows Messenger or whatever it is back in the day. And so it's, okay, and what do you mean? Well, it's just understand everything about it, So it's for somebody just getting into the field. It also helped that this was in Ottawa in the middle of winter, and I'm not from Ottawa. So it meant like it's super cold, it's super snowy. It's like dark outside from like, I don't know, 9 a.m. Up to 9 a.m. and like again at 3 p.m. So I had nothing else to do. So I was just
no incentive to go outside. Okay.
Exactly.
I'm in Chicago, so I can relate. Yeah. So Well, that seems very forward thinking. Is that a sort of a common thing with security that they're just basically telling you sort of like learn on the job, and we learn by sort of seeing how you learn, or do you think that was kind of a unique test case?
I think it was pretty unique.
Okay.
I think that organization, and then furthermore, kind of that kind of group, did not have the same kind of pressures and limitations of other places, right? Like if you're an intern in a company, like, whether you want it or not, like the company, has like monetary incentive, and like,
yes.
They want things to work, like to move forward. Right. And so those guys had kind of the luxury to go and say, like, what they did, first of all, was very kind of open-minded. You had to think outside the box. So it was their incentive to communicate that all the way through to internships.
Can you, based on, you've seen the world from both sides now, to quote the old song, can you make any generalizations between security practices on the governmental or federal level and security in the private sector?
That's a good question. I think to kind of like clarify, I would even say intelligence and then federal and then private sector, right? I think intelligence agencies are a totally different world that have very different business drivers, to put it in business.
Yeah.
Now, looking back at sort of federal government and private sector, there are pretty big differences. I think I think what I've seen more is people being worried, like truly worried about the consequence of what it does in the private sector. People, especially, more so nowadays, kind of realizing that, like, hey, this can have really deep cost and impact. In the government, I think it wildly varied depending where in the government. If you were talking to somebody in, I'll use like U.S. terms, right? But like working in the White House, like, there's probably like also, big concerns and people being serious about it. But if you're in, agriculture somewhere, there tends to be the stakes are much lower. And so the kind of classic, the line I've actually heard at one point in my career talking to somebody like that in a smaller government, which was, all I want from you is just to tell me which box I need to buy and put on my network to be safe. And it was kind of the compliance part was really, really overwhelming.
Got it. But I mean, you say the stakes are low in a smaller network like that, but they're really not. Like, I mean, we've heard enough stories about hackers like breaking into, water treatment plant, networks and trying to, poison the water supply and stuff. So, I mean, at this point, everybody's a target, but, I understand that obviously the White House or what have you have layers and layers and layers on top of layers. But I think that's interesting that it's so much of it is compliance based, and it's just like, please let me not think about it,
Yeah, exactly. And I think what it is, for a place like White House, for example, is more, yes, there are many layers, but the damage from, I will say kind of the PR, right? Public relations, that's very visible, is a concept, like front of mind, right? Whereas if you're in something, again, I don't mean to pick on agriculture. I think it's really important, but like,
of course, yeah.
It's not the water supply or the electric supply. It tends to, kind of not as worrisome.
It's a lesser disruption. Yeah,
exactly.
So for the benefit of listeners who are starting or choosing where to start in their cybersecurity careers, which is a fair number of them, we find it helpful to ask guests about the day-to-day work of their current position. So can you tell me about the average day or an average workload as the head of LimaCharlie? Are there tasks that you're engaged in most days, and how much time is spent inputting with clients, and how much is involved in putting out fires and so forth?
That's a good question, and it's a really, really evolving question, right? So we are a startup. So what that means is like that picture is like constantly shifting. So today, that I'll pick a point in time.
Okay.
we do things like fundraising, we do things like sales, but also I'm still very involved in sort of the day-to-day development and operations. So what that means is, classic day for me is maybe we'll do one call with a venture capital. So that's kind of a totally different frame of mind, right? Because then I'm trying to sell the vision in the long term and who we are trying to do. I'll do a call with a potential customer. So those tend to be really interesting because we in our case we have a lot of different types of customers doing different types of things, and my background is pretty deep, cybersecurity. So I like, but I don't get to do it so much these days. So I do like to.
That's something I always ask about is do you I mean, obviously you've picked your life here, but do you regret not being able to sort of like get your hands dirty with the stuff as much as work on the client side or work on the managerial side?
I miss it. I definitely miss doing it, but I don't. What I don't miss is having to do it day in, day out.
Okay.
There's a lot of, depending where you are, right? But like if you're doing like incident response or things like that, it's just a lot of firefighting. It's a lot of like, very pressure work. And
you're always on, I imagine. You always kind of teeth gritted and yeah.
Exactly. So now I get to, I get to chat to people about these interesting topics and most importantly is I know what I'm talking about as well. So that really helps bridge the gap, talking to people. So there's going to be that. And then there's going to be, some development on the side and, infrastructure and kind of looking, the way things are developing, costing and all that kind of stuff.
Gotcha. So of course, before you got to LimaCharlie, you worked several other places, and I like to take the opportunity to drill into your career journey as well, as it has some big names and some interesting timelines. So as I mentioned, you were an early part of Crowdstrike in 2013 for about 10 months. So what did you do in that capacity, and why did you move so quickly to your next opportunity?
So there, I forget what my official position was, but that was really, really early Crowdstrike. So as in all early companies, like titles doesn't mean so much, a whole lot. But I would describe it as I helped architect and put in place kind of early systems of what was eventually going to become, I want to say they call it Overwatch now. Right? They're monitoring services.
Yes.
So very early on. It's and I think that's an interesting topic for this discussion, particularly because it's all psychology, right? So I left the government, not just the government, but the intelligence sector, which kind of means if you think of like the mentality as you're leaving a place like that, it's a cliche, but it's also very true. It's this idea of you're doing work to help protect the country kind of thing, right? So I would say on the spectrum of idealistic to pure money hungry, it's very, very, very far on pretty far on the idealistic side of things.
Yeah.
So I was very, very much security operations and practitioner there, and idealistic, leaving. First job in the private sector. I'd never actually worked in the private sector.
Right. That makes sense.
For a startup. So the gap between where I was and where leadership was in the company was really wide. And I don't think there's like it's all a gray spectrum, right? Like now starting a company, I realized that everybody's got to pay the bills, right? But that gap was really, really wide. And I think it was just too much of a gap for me to kind of get into the job, right? I really wanted to go and have a deep impact on detecting bad people.
Yes.
And doing that at scale is a different deal than doing it as an individual contributor.
Right.
And so that gap was kind of a big jump.
So from there, you spent a year and a quarter at Arcadia as the CTO and chief architect, then moved on to senior security engineer at Google for a year, and then senior security engineer at Chronicle for another year and a half. So can you talk about some of the experiences and skills you picked up at each of these positions and how it helped to position you to take on your next highest job opportunity?
Yeah. Especially like Google is its own thing, right?
Sure.
So
yeah.
What it means is I don't think, when you apply there, it's you they're evaluating and not so much your previous positions, right? So, so I think, getting my foot into Google, obviously from there on, that was a huge benefit.
Of course.
From the name, right? But at first within Google, I did a lot of development around Windows endpoint, which historically endpoints has been, where I really focused my career.
Okay.
So it was a normal move. So a lot of Windows development around endpoint technologies, and the way that I kind of transitioned into Chronicle, which is, there's Google X, they're theoretically sort of separate, but not really. But for me, the trend in my whole career has always been that I would try to push and build things that had not been built before.
Yeah.
Right. So seeing the opportunity really, really early on, hearing about this new startup being created in Google X around cybersecurity, that really piqued my interest. And so that's when I went to, talk to those guys. And it was a good fit and eventually made the move. The Google, Chronicle and Google X itself, it's that was a really, truly unique kind of experience in my mind, in that Google X, like I said, is sort of separate, but not really. And the whole kind of concept, right, is they start, kind of like a bit of a skunk works internally, right? Like trying to, do a new moonshot, like do new thing that's really big. As it's kind of rolling out internally, at some point, they decide like, hey, we cancel it, or we go and we spin it off into its own company. And that's how kind of the Chronicle really, came alive. But during that internal bit is the really unique part, because it's Google X, meaning, there's, I'm, all the money in the world kind of thing, right? You're a startup with like, I don't know, $50 million in the bank, right? So is it a startup? Yes and no.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So that's really why, like, it was unique, because we were trying to do extremely big things, or looking for, for extremely big things to solve, with the means to do it.
Yeah. You don't see that very often. It's sort of startup goals with big investment behind it.
Exactly. But I would say, having kind of lived it, I think it's definitely there's pros and cons to it, right?
Oh, really?
Oh, absolutely. Because yes, you've got, all the investment behind you, right? You can go and do those big things, but it also indirectly changes the mentality of the startup. I think, there's not this pressure around, if you're, picking the cliche tiny company in a garage, right? There's a lot of pressure to make things work and to push the boundary and really take risks and do these things. Yeah. Whereas if you've got all this money, in a way, you've got a bit of a pressure not to take too much risk either.
Okay.
You don't have the pressure as much to go to market and have this product and, really, really push it. Yep. So it's pros and cons.
Pros and cons. So do you, taking your own personal experiences and applying them to a more philosophical sort of overarching framework, do you think that the time spent on one job before moving to the next is changing in length in these days, especially in terms of the so-called great resignation that's been happening over the first few years? I mean, when I got into the industry, I was always like, I always heard don't don't stay less than 3 years at a place, but don't stay more than 3 years because you're not going to learn anything new and so forth. But I mean, you've had some very sort of quick stepping stones that brought sort of big dividends. And I don't know if you think that's something that can be applied overall, or if that's just your case specifically.
That's a great question. I don't actually see it that way when looking at my career. So I never made like the conscious decision, like, hey, this is, I'm going to do this to step up my career kind of thing.
Got it.
I think, this is kind of a gut feeling, right? But that the Great Resignation is a really, really good thing, especially for industries that have a much lower salary, right? That have less education requirement, kind of where unions have been kind of historically. But I don't know if I haven't really started feeling it in cybersecurity, and I think maybe it's because, in a weird way, we exactly you said. I feel like we've had it for a long time in a way in security. Like staying a year and a half in some place has been it's been kind of almost the norm for a lot of people that I know. So I don't think that part has changed so much. I think what really is critical in my mind to the progression is sort of, I guess, twofold. One is taking things away from a job, right? I think working somewhere, there's very few places that you could work at and not get anything from it, even if it's an awful job and you don't like it and all that. Sure. I feel like there's some learning you should get from it.
Yep. Even if it's self-directed.
Exactly. So I think that's kind of one big aspect, and the other one is learning. I guess maybe it's related, but learning what you want out of the job, right? We have a luxury in security, a huge labor shortage. Security is a really big industry, many different types of things to be done. And I think it gives us the luxury to figure out, hey, do I want this, this cushy, Google job, like to put in my terms, right? And kind of, do interesting things, but, kind of work, kind of, government based kind of thing. Or do I want to do, firefighting, incident response? I know a ton of people that just love it. Yeah. Or, development or policy work. There's just so many different things. So I think, I see the progression in my career as a refinement at every step of me realizing, learning specific things and then realizing, I don't like this, but I do like this. And so it's adjusting the course every step of the way. Right. So it's not the sort of traditional, first I was a junior manager, then I was a senior manager, then I own the company, and then blah, blah, blah. But it's more, it's more of the sort of pivoting of, if you don't like what you do, then do something else kind of thing. Exactly. Yeah. So I want to talk about LimaCharlie a little bit, and sort of our larger topic around security tools. So you had an excellent article on your LimaCharlie company blog explaining the reason you created this sort of universal platform, especially as it ties into the evolution of cybersecurity as a practice. And so I want to start with that, the evolution of cybersecurity. The article notes that one large problem for security departments is the production of sort of specialized security tools that turn into an exercise in extreme logistics, as companies have to acquire a dozen, if not 100 or more specialized tools to do the work of securing their business, and then to make that all somehow connect and communicate. So you noted that it's because it's easier and more profitable to create a tool with a hyper-specialized use that you get this siloed landscape with an infinite number of security tool choices that have sprung up. So do you have any thoughts on whether this was preventable, given a time machine and the benefit of hindsight? Do you have any thoughts as to how the original wave of cybersecurity tool creators and architects could have done things differently, or is this just the way it was always going to be? I think it's just natural evolution. I think it's absolutely natural for smaller scope siloed products to be to be a core part of innovation in any industry, right? You can't spring out of nothing and be General Motors and kind of be, all the,
Right.
Those guys buy those smaller companies.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a core part of it. And what happened is we are a brand, like a really, really new industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're just now starting to get into, this maturity of, it's like, we're teenagers, we get a driving permit, right? We start to understand like what the world is, what are the best ways to do things and not do things. And so when we didn't have that, that's why everything was just like a one-off product. Everybody was trying things, trying to get all those learnings, this institutional, learning.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're starting to kind of shift into that second phase where, we know what a lot of those concepts are, right? Like I feel like defense in depth was sort of the very first, tagline that had learnings behind it, right? And it was a chunk of institutional learning. But we have things like the MITRE framework now, which are a lot less, in a way, cutting edge and cool and sexy. But you know what? Like that's how we, as humans, if you look at engineering, we got to building the big bridges that we have today. Not just by having a bunch of people trying to, throw stuff at the wall, but like at some point, the formulas, became like, okay, this is how you do this. And so I think that's why there's that transition. So I think, it's absolutely natural that we had it, and we will always have those smaller scope products. Mm-hmm. But we've got to transform as well. We've got to get those big learnings in. And I think then is when we start to take, a lot of the collection of those, like, smaller tools or smaller use cases and say like, those things really worked. Now let's take those one-offs and do something, proper that we can build upon for the future, for, maturity.
Yeah, tie it all together. So where do you think security departments most frequently fail when designing their security strategy? Do you think that this piecemeal approach to building a security toolkit results in blind spots that aren't noticed until the worst happens?
I think that story is very different depending on who we're talking about, right? So we mostly deal with people that are on the higher side of maturity in cybersecurity. We deal with security professionals. Mm-hmm. So I have that biased view. That being said, every now and then, we do talk to smaller places, right? Sometimes they're startups, sometimes they're just kind of smaller companies. And there, really, I think the common mistake that I see is people trying to do too much themselves. It's a cliche, but there's a reason it's a cliche of like buying a tool and nobody's watching what the tool's doing, right? Mm-hmm. So I think those folks would be better off by going to an MSSP or to somebody that can help them do security, knows what they're doing. Right. But on the bigger side of things, it's very different. Mm-hmm. I think there, the critical thing that's got to change is that we see a lot of bigger companies relying too much on the promise of a vendor, right? Mm. So for somebody to the promise of a vendor. So somebody saying, hey, I have this tool. It tells me it protects me against bad stuff. Mm-hmm. And okay, that doesn't sound like a very mature defensive.
Right. I turn it on and it does its thing in the background and I don't think about it.
Exactly. I would love it to be true. Like,
right. We all would.
If it can be wrong on one thing, it's that. Like, mm-hmm. I joke sometimes, like, I want my grandma to be able to stop the Russians, like, just installing it. That's great.
Amazing. We did it.
So I think those bigger organizations need to start shifting into a mode where they know their security posture, right? They mm-hmm. think about what exactly are the things we need to detect. How are we going to do that? And kind of approach that very transparently.
Okay. From discussing state of world security and our part in it, we want to turn now to the work side of the Cyber Work podcast and talk about the work of security, whether it's security engineer, architect, analyst. LimaCharlie seems to be crafted for a variety of levels and types of positions to interact with in different ways. So can you tell me your thoughts on the current state of security practice and the process of learning, study, experience, and career advancement that you recommend to kind of grow and develop in this industry?
Sure. And that's a pretty wide question, right?
Sure. Oh yeah. Start big and then we'll narrow in a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. I think, so it's a really, really wide industry. So the first thing I feel that people should think about is not to narrow their view, right? Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people come in and see, let's say, the red teaming, right? Like penetration. Mm-hmm. As like the first thing that they see because it strikes the imagination.
Yeah, it's exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. But there's a lot of excitement in blue teaming. But there's also a lot of value and different people drive a lot of interest out of things like policy work and all that kind of stuff. So don't over focus. Go and talk to people that are even remotely kind of doing security. That I think that's a very, very valuable thing. The other part, I think, of around career growth is this idea of understanding what you're doing. That sounds like a funny statement, but I think we're getting to the point where it's easy and sometimes encouraged to, hey, I use this tool. I know how to use this tool. This thing tells me that. But I think for in terms of longevity of your career and being able to pick and choose where you go towards the future, it's really important to try to understand, in this example, what the tool is doing, right? What's happening behind the curtain. So understanding kind of the fundamentals of security. We talk about like exploit. What does that look like, right? What does memory look like? All these things. It doesn't mean that you have to become an expert at, building exploits. Probably not.
Yeah.
But at least having a grasp of what it is, because that's how you're able to go from, maybe today at your job, you're learning to use this one tool. Mm-hmm. The next job that you're trying to get, maybe they don't use that tool. And that will vary tremendously the amount of effort that you're going to have selling yourself to get that job. If you have to go and say like, no, I can use this other tool versus it doesn't matter which tool you're giving me. I understand what's behind.
Understanding the larger concepts and so forth. So from a professional standpoint, what advice would you give cybersecurity students getting their knowledge and experience in 2022? Are there any trends, pivots, or innovations that they should be looking at in the new year? Or, obviously know your fundamentals and so forth, but what do you see on the horizon that people should be watching out for?
I think, there's the staples, right, of cybersecurity, understanding. I think endpoint technology is really, really critical, understanding that. But more and more, I would say the sleeper here is cloud security. Mm-hmm. It's becoming more and more complex, and people are relying more and more. And as that complexity grows, it means that there's more, dark corners. So getting involved into understanding those and being comfortable in that kind of ecosystem is going to be a big driver to kind of future jobs and requirements in those jobs.
All right. So as we wrap up today, Maxime, thank you for your time. This has been a masterclass on I think just general career movement within a cybersecurity field. You just went above and beyond on so many different things that I like to ask people about. And so thank you for that. But as we wrap up, can you tell our listeners any more aspects about LimaCharlie that you'd like them to know about and some of the projects and products that you're excited about going into in the new year?
That's kind of the cool part about what we do is we get to touch a lot of different things. So we've been very endpoint driven so far. So, around the EDR space, all that, it's really cool. But I think the coolest part is as we're kind of fulfilling our vision, we're adding a lot this year of external data sources. So we're adding other EDRs, we're adding a lot of cloud logging into the platform. And so, I see it like a big pot where we're cooking. And so we had plenty of EDR, but as we add those other things, I think it kind of changes fundamentally, how people are going to use our platform and how people are going to see their ability to go and reach across the stack, right? All the way from like the iPhone of the CEO to, the developer logging in to GitHub, right? So, so the kind of thing that excites me for the year for us.
Very cool. So one last question. If our listeners want to learn more about LimaCharlie or Maxime Lamothe-Brassard, where should they go online?
LimaCharlie.io is the spot. And we have a community Slack, and we have documentations and YouTube channels. So there's a ton to see there.
Beautiful. Maxime, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been so fascinating.
Thank you. That was great.
And as always, thank you to everyone listening to and supporting the show at home. New episodes of the Cyberwork podcast are available every Monday at 1 p.m. Central, both on our video on our YouTube page and on audio wherever you get your podcasts. I'm excited to announce that our Infosec Skills platform will be releasing a new challenge every single month with 3 hands-on labs that will put your cyber skills to the test. Each month, you'll build new skills ranging from secure coding to penetration testing to advanced persistent threats and everything in between. Plus, we're giving away more than $1,000 worth of prizes each month. So go to infosecinstitute.com/challenge and get started right now. Thank you so much once again to Maxime Lamothe-Brassard, and thank you all so much for watching and listening. We'll speak to you next week.